better you get at surfing, the more fun it is. Really excited to teach surfing.
Welcome to the Surf Mastery Podcast. We interview the world's best surfers and the people behind them to provide you with education and inspiration to surf better. Welcome back to the show. Thanks for tuning in. A little bit of housekeeping before we get to the interview. Firstly, I've had a lot of listener emails. Big thanks for the emails, guys. It really does help. Like when you send in an email just saying you enjoy the show, that is awesome. It really does help me keep motivated to get these things out, knowing that there's people out there that are listening and appreciating. Having said that, I'm not going to read any of them out on air. That's not really what the show is about. I want this to be more of an educational resource that's going to be timeless. So please keep them coming in because I do appreciate them, but I probably won't reply and I probably won't read them out online, but they are appreciated. Some of the emails have been in regards to the show notes, asking where they are. Now, the show notes are at surfmastery.com/podcast, and then you can just go to the particular show you're interested in and you'll see them there. Okay, into it. Today's guest is Roo Hill. Roo is originally from the UK, where he grew up surfing and then became a surf coach. He's done your conventional entry-level surf lessons as well as video coaching for competitors. Roo's vision was to create a scientifically informed coaching methodology that bridges the gap between the two extremes, the beginner and the competitor. And in 2007, Roo moved to Nosara in Costa Rica, where he set up Surf Simply out of the back of his car. 10 years later, Surf Simply is a high-end coaching resort which needs to be booked a year in advance. As well as running the resort, Roo is also a co-host on the Surf Simply podcast on iTunes and from their website. I urge you guys check that out. My audio on this interview was not great, so I've done the best I can with making it sound less harsh, but please just bear with my audio. Roo's audio is perfect, it's nice and clear, and that's what it's about. It's about the guest, not myself, so please just bear with that. And this was an awesome interview. I got a lot out of this. Roo is a very experienced surf coach who's worked with a very broad range of clients, and he's got a very logical, scientific sort of way of looking at surf coaching, which I love. I love, as a coach myself, I love that, really breaking things down. And anyway, without further ado, enjoy. Tell us how you got into surfing, Roo.
I came to it pretty late in life, compared to a lot of the people that I'm sure you're working with as competitive surfers. I didn't start surfing until I was 15 or 16. I grew up in Bristol and used to spend my summers down at the beach in Cornwall, where the sort of the main swell hits the UK. That's sort of the most consistent spot. And I finished school and I actually went to art college and I decided that I was going to take a year out and just move down to Cornwall and surf. And then I did that for a summer. And I thought, I'm going to go off and do a winter in Indo. That looks pretty fun. So I did that. And then I came back and I thought, I'm just scratching the surface here. I really need to get into it. So I carried on doing that for a few years. And I got into surf coaching when I was about 18 or 19 as a way of just funding my Indo trips and everything. I guess my whole career kind of like just blossomed from there, really. And
what got you into surf coaching?
As I say, originally it was just a way of kind of funding my trips, and it's kind of bizarre actually. So this is slightly tangential, but I grew up in a very religious household, and as any of your listeners that have grown up in a similar environment probably do as well, you sort of get into the habit of like picking holes in things and seeing how robust ideas really are when you put them under scrutiny. And so when I came to surf coaching, and I was just doing the standard entry level kind of lessons, and I was kind of like, I wonder how solid these ways of teaching are. Like, I wonder how much real thought has gone into it. Like, I wonder if there's good data behind these kind of ideas that are being taught as if they're fact. So I sort of started pulling at all the threads a little bit, and I was really lucky because this was back in the 90s in the UK, and this doesn't happen anymore, but at the time the surf school I was working at had a monopoly on what was a very popular beach. And so when I arrived at the surf school, there was 30 or 40 people a day, and I think there was 3 instructors. And by the time I left nearly 10 years later, on a busy day there'd be 600 people coming through the surf school, and there was 20 or 25 coaches, and I would go down to the water's edge in the morning with like my lunch on my back, and I would do a lesson of 10 or 12 people, and then I would stay down there when they walked up, and the next 10 or 12 people would come down, and it was really like a machine, very, very different to what I do now. But it was actually a fantastic opportunity because it meant I could do A/B testing. I could just say, okay, I'm going to teach 50 or 100 people, to put their hand here, and I'm going to teach 50 people to put their hand here, and I can start actually gathering data on what works and what doesn't work. And of course, there's so many uncontrollable variables in trying to do something like that. What the ocean's like, what the fitness of the people you're teaching is like, that you just have to have these huge numbers to just compensate for all the noise that's going to be there in the data. And, by doing that, I started to kind of tease out what was working and what wasn't working. And I guess the other thing that really kind of hit me during that time was I was doing some kids club coaching as well with some sort of more experienced surfers who were riding shortboards and turning off the top, and I spent a bit of time helping coach the British junior team as well. And it suddenly became really obvious to me that as I watched friends of mine who were surf coaches, and I watched their careers evolve, and they all wanted to go off and work with competitive surfers at the highest level they could. And it became really obvious that there was just these two very different kind of industries. There's this niche of performance surf coaching for competitors and elite level surfers, and then there's this kind of entry level surf school, surf lessons, how to stand up on a board type stuff, which I'm sure everyone's very familiar with. And actually 99% of surfers fall in between those two extremes, and there's really nothing out there for them. And that was really where the idea for Surf Simile came from.
Mm-hmm. Did you receive surf coaching yourself? I mean, how did you progress your own surfing?
Well, I was fortunate enough to work with to spend a lot of long winters in Indo with some really talented surfers. And, they would do the sort of the giving of tips rather than the structured kind of formalized roadmap that we sort of work with now. And who else was a really big influence, actually? Martin Dunn, who I think you've interviewed on the show. He was one of the only people around at the time that was sort of publicly making available some of his approach to surfing, to surf coaching, sorry. And so I sort of looked at what he was doing, and I thought, okay, that's all like shortboarders surfing with more speed and power and flow. And then, I've got these people that I'm also working with who've sort of just learned to stand up and catch unbroken waves. And like, how do we get these people from catching an unbroken wave and trimming down the line to the point where they're even ready to start thinking about, compression through their bottom turn and getting really vertical to 12 o'clock rather than, 11 o'clock or whatever, that big kind of disconnect gap. So, yeah, I kind of approached it by just saying, all right, well, let's try and be a bit scientific about it. So we'll take an idea, a hypothesis, like, for example, let's have the leading hand outside the heel rail rather than pointing towards the nose of the board, which is the way the conventional entry-level surf lesson is done. And then you kind of look at, how plausible is the mechanism? So you have this basic idea in science, which I really like because I think it applies to life really well. So someone has an idea, and if it's a really plausible idea, you don't need very much evidence to tell you that it's probably right. And if the idea is really implausible, then you need, a huge amount of evidence to tell you that it's right. There's this old saying by Carl Sagan, the guy who used to run NASA, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So I kind of took that and plugged it into surfing. And just kind of rethought about how it could be approached. The first thing that was, I guess, a big shift is we stopped teaching people to stand up as the main goal. So the first thing that we did was just to try and approach it differently right from the get-go. So rather than teaching people to stand up, which is what everyone wants to do when they first come to surfing, because it's this binary, very obvious thing that every layperson can see you're either failing or succeeding to do. We sort of got people to understand that surfing is really just this game of trying to get your board as close to the whitewater as you can without getting your board stuck in the whitewater. And in order to play that game, you don't necessarily have to stand up. I mean, you can see kneeboarders and bodyboarders actually doing that really well. So we'd teach people this idea of, okay, the board has these like invisible buttons on it. We sometimes call it secret buttons. The accelerator, the brake, the trim right, trim left, carve right, carve left buttons, and all kind of the nuances of the buttons in between those primary ones. And we'd get people while they're still laying down, like day one, to move their weight around on the board and understand where all of these buttons are. And then rather than getting them to stand up as sort of the end goal, we'd get them to stand up just because at a certain point, laying down on the board, you can't press those buttons quickly enough and powerfully enough. So then they'd stand up into, what we call the functional stance, which is a way of standing, which you see a lot of pro surfers using. And rather than just being a stable way of riding in on a wave, it's a way of pressing all of those buttons quickly and powerfully. And and then we kind of take it forward from there. And it was really interesting because when we started Surf Simply, we had a lot of entry-level surfers coming along, and we would get a lot of emails and people getting in touch saying, my girlfriend or my boyfriend doesn't surf, I do, so I'm not having lessons, but they don't surf, so they need lessons. And we kind of had this thing like, well, if you played golf, you wouldn't say, I don't need golf lessons because I already play golf or tennis, and so why does that exist in surfing? And I think the answer is that there really isn't very much coaching out there for that, for the vast majority of surfers. It's just kind of not available. So we had to sort of re-educate people, and most of our guests come from the States. We get more and more from Australia and New Zealand now, but probably about 90% of our guests come from the States, and trying to actually show them that okay, this is of value to you. That was about 10 years ago we started Surf Simply, and now 70 or 80% of our guests have been surfing for more than 10 years, and we still have entry-level people come along, and most of what we do is video coaching, and we do a bit of in-water coaching as well, but most people are at that kind of level. And it's interesting because we now get booked up about, I think our next opening at the moment is October next year. So we get booked up nearly a year in advance. And and as far as I know, I don't think anyone else is really doing this. But I mean, you're kind of more aware of the coaching scene that's out in Australia than I am. So, maybe it is happening and I'm just not aware of it. But it seems to be something that a lot of people, once they feel confident that they're going to come along and actually get coaching, rather than just have a sort of very basic entry-level lesson, which really wasn't much use to them as someone who's been surfing for 5 or 10 or 20 years. Once they feel confident that they're going to get that, they're really, really excited to be able to receive it and to have new tools to sort of get away from that plateau that they've been sitting on and actually start moving forward again. Because, the better you get at surfing, the more fun it is. And the better you get at surfing, the wider range of conditions you can go out and have fun in.
Oh, yeah. I think my surfing has progressed more in the past 18 months than it has in the previous 12 years. Just from a handful of, video coaching sessions. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it's so fun as well when you suddenly have new things to be able to go out and work on. I tell you just one little cool story. So, I mean, this is quite an extreme example, but we have this really cool lady who comes and bakes muffins for us at Surf Simply. Her name's Lulu, and she's Hawaiian. And anyway, she's really got into surfing in her 50s, and she's now 69. We just had her birthday party last night, actually. And she's improved so much between 64 and 69. It's made me really excited about the future. I always used to think that I was going to just level off around in my late 20s and that was it. So, yeah, it's kind of cool to see.
What's the best surfing advice you ever got?
That's a tough question. I mean, there's so many things, isn't there? I suppose I don't know if this is a specific piece of advice because I can't remember when the light bulb moment was, and whether it was something specific someone said to me, or whether it was kind of an aggregate of several experiences and working with people. But I think the thing that made the biggest change for me, and I see impact the most of our guests and really change their surfing, is when they get their head around the idea that you don't want to turn just by leaning on your heels and your toes. I mean, of all of the things that we teach, when you teach people how to carve rather than trim their turns, it's so great to watch someone's mind just get blown. So I'll just explain what I mean by that in a little more detail. This is a classic thing. This probably happens, 3 or 4 people a week this happens with. They'll come along, they've been surfing for like 10 or 15 years, and they're doing all of the turns on their board by not really getting their weight back. They've got their back foot a little far forward, maybe like, so let's say they're riding a shortboard, their back foot's sort of near the front of the deck pad. Their weight's fairly evenly on both feet, and they're leaning on their heels, to turn onto their backside, their toes to turn onto their front side. And then what's happening, we call that a trim turn, where your weight's not really going back. And then what's happening is the rocker of the board, as the board is put on its side, is making the board change direction. And of course, the shorter the board, the more rocker it has, then the more it'll change direction when you just lean on your heels or your toes, and that trim turn happens. But you hit this brick wall. You can't turn more than 90 degrees doing that. The physics just don't work quickly. I mean, you can turn very slowly. So what people tend to do is they ride like a bigger board when they want to get their wave count up, when they're first sort of learning, and then when they want to do more radical turns, tighter turns with a smaller turning arc, they'll ride a smaller and smaller board, and they're feeling like they're turning better, but they're still just doing those trim turns. And we take people and we put them back on a bigger board, so they've got more speed and they're getting into the wave earlier. And then we teach them about getting their weight right back, lifting the nose of the board up and carving round using the fins. And when people suddenly realize that they can do that, it just like blows their mind, because they've seen all of these carving turns off the top and cutbacks, and they've just been not able to do them because every time they lean too hard, they catch their rail and just fall off the board. And suddenly showing them the doorway into be able to doing those kinds of turns is it's really cool. And I think probably that was one of the things that made me suddenly really excited to teach surfing, because I saw, when I had that realization, I was like, this can be so much more fun with just a little bit of knowledge. And you can surf for so long without realizing that. I mean, I'm sure that you've seen people surfing for 10, 20, 30 years that still really just go down the line and do all their turns as sort of less than a 90-degree change of direction. Can you think of anyone that that surfs like that?
Yeah, it's pretty much most people, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
If golf had the same, thought process behind it, then no one on the golf course would have a single-digit handicap. But, most golfers get really involved in it, and they get lessons, and they get down to the single-figure handicaps. And, there's a lot of golfers with single-figure handicaps, and I think there's far less surfers surfing each wave to its potential, and to use your words, close to the whitewash. And, you really do need to start learning the way you put it, carving turns.
And it's interesting, and it's a big kind of cultural thing, I think, in surfing. It's funny so it's interesting comparing Australia to the US, because, in Australia, there's still a big kind of like alternative lifestyle cultural element to surfing, but it's a lot more widely recognized as a sport than it is in the US, where it's very much seen still much more as a lifestyle and as a sort of it's just not looked at as a mainstream sport in the same way that it is in Australia. So there isn't that kind of coaching, clubby kind of culture and ethos that people bring to it. And, one thing that we say to our guests when they come along each week, and, the way that we coach is just in the format of a week rather than on an ongoing basis. And that's kind of an interesting thing to work with from a coaching point of view as well, which I'll chat about a little bit later. But when people arrive, we say to them, look, we don't approach surfing as a lifestyle. There's all of this cultural baggage that gets hung onto surfing, political ideology, what your job priorities should be, how you should be living, even, what clothes you're wearing, and perhaps even what music you're listening to, and your types of opinions on what kind of food you're eating. And, all of this stuff kind of comes as a package. And we say to people, look, we're just going to leave all that at the front door. We're going to approach surfing this week as a sport, just like you would any other sport. And if you leave this week with the drills and mechanisms in place to go on improving, then all of that cool stuff, all of the travel, all of the people you'll meet, all of those moments of sitting out in the ocean and being overwhelmed by the beauty of nature, that's all going to happen just on its own. Our goal is just to approach it as a sport, because that way you're going to get better quicker, and that's kind of where the fun is, So we've really tried to depart from the whole lifestyle thing. And it's funny because, I spend a lot of time obviously going online, and we do like a lot of photos for Instagram and little short videos and stuff to let people know what we do and what we're all about. And everyone else out there running a surf camp in the world is making such a big thing about it being a lifestyle. And we're like I feel like we're pulling in exactly the polar opposite direction to everyone else.
No, I love that approach. Actually, looking at your tree of knowledge, for the level 4 surfing, you've got understanding contest criteria, and you talk about, maximizing speed, power, and flow. I mean, that's the criteria for contests. But if you have that approach in mind, it's also the fastest way to progress, is what you're saying here, which makes sense. So you're looking at it from a sport, but also it's completely relative. If you think surfing is an art form or a lifestyle, it's still relevant.
Yeah, and it's funny actually. We talk about although on that kind of tree of knowledge, and just for your listeners that might not have seen it, the idea is that we put. Obviously, it's a massive oversimplification, because you couldn't put all the surf skills in an infographic without it being completely overwhelming. But the idea is that you have, the core surf skills in different coloured bubbles, and when you can do any one of them most of the time, not all the time, because you can never have a 100% success rate, but you can move on to the next. And if you skip out some of those steps, you can keep going, but you'll always hit a brick wall unless you kind of go back and fill them in. And we've sort of split it up into 4 levels. The level 1 stuff is in the white water. The level 2 stuff is catching unbroken waves. The level 3 stuff is performing horizontal maneuvers, so primarily cutbacks, roundhouse cutbacks, floaters, and pumping as well. And then level 4 is, more like the sort of stuff that Martin Dunn is teaching, vertical surfing, and like you say, starting to surf more to the contest criteria with more speed and power and flow. But we introduced that contest criteria and talked to people about it right the way back when they're sort of first going out the back and catching waves. And, I really think if you go out and you try and, stand on your board and just look cool with your unbuttoned hipster shirt blowing in the wind going down the line, you might enjoy that one wave a lot more. But 5 or 10 or 20 years later, you haven't really improved that much. If you're constantly trying to surf to the critical part of the wave with better flow and more speed and more power, any one given wave, you're probably you're more likely to fall off because you're trying to do stuff that you can't do. But, the aggregate of those constant attempts over 10 or 20 years is that you're improving more. And, and that means you get all that much more joy out of it. And it's funny because the ironic thing for me is, and this is just, I'm only saying this because I think it's funny, not really because I have any problem with the whole concept of free surfing. I think it's a wonderful thing. But I always think that the contest surfers are going out there and actually trying to surf with more speed, power, and flow. They're trying to surf the wave better and get deeper in the barrel and do all this stuff. The sort of the free surfers, they're actually going out and basically, as far as their job goes, they're trying to get their photo taken or trying to get good footage for a movie. So while the free surfing route is often sort of sold as the more soulful side, it's almost ironic, isn't it, that the contest surfers are actually trying to surf the wave better, and the free soulful guys actually are trying to get their photo taken. And when you look at it like that, you've got to be like, well, which one is more soulful? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and the pro surfers end up with the best free surfing videos anyway.
Oh yeah, I mean, how much are you looking forward to all the footage that's going to be coming out from Taj now that he's off the tour and can do what he wants?
Yeah. And me personally, I think surfing needs to be approached in both ways. I think to spend some of your time surfing, really breaking things down and spending time working on just one thing for a surf, And then when you do just decide to go out on a free surf, you have so much more fun.
Yeah, and absolutely, that's a really important part of it as well. The last few years I've spent most of my time training coaches rather than coaching, and one of the big lessons that we teach them is when to stop coaching, when to just pick up on the kind of the emotional cues that people are a little overwhelmed, and when you step back and when you suddenly change the conversation and you ask them about something totally unrelated to surfing, and we just so that they relax and switch off, because it's definitely possible to overthink things, as in all sports coaching. That's kind of a problem. So yeah, going out and having just free surfs and not thinking about it and just having fun is a really important part of it as well. I mean, that's when you kind of reap the rewards of the previous year's worth of drills that you've been doing. And actually, when people go away, one of the things we say to them is, we hope you'll get some fun weeks while you're staying with us, obviously, but the real point is to give you the tools to take away and keep improving. And, rather than just going for a surf and hoping you get better, you'll go in the water and have your watch on and be like, okay, for 20 minutes, I'm just going to practice doing like my carving turn. And then for 20 minutes, I'm just going to make sure that I'm keeping my hand in the right place when I come up to my feet. But then also we're like, and then for 20 minutes, you're like, I'm not going to think about anything. I'm just going to be out here just goofing around in the water and having fun. And that's such an important part of it too, I think.
Oh, for sure. Let's go back to your tree of knowledge, because I think it's awesome, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes for those listening as well. But there's one thing you've got in your level 4, which I like, and it's called surfing to the targets. Could you explain and expand on that for us?
Yeah, so that's another thing which is like a bit of a light bulb moment, I think, for a lot of people. And that actually came to me from watching a lot of the stuff that Martin Dunn was doing, and then kind of, I guess, not moving it forward, but just building on it in a slightly different direction so that it was relevant for surfers that weren't already kind of familiar with that idea of targets. But a lot of people just think about trying to surf down the line and make the wave, and that's kind of the goal. And then they hit this point where, of course, if they're surfing faster than the wave, then they're surfing out into the flats and losing speed. And if the wave is outrunning them, then, they're getting stuck behind sections. So, you teach people how to do floaters to climb over sections that are breaking in front of them, and how to do carving cutbacks to surf to cut back to the pocket and to do a roundhouse cutback and get speed from that pocket of the wave again that way. And surfing to the targets is the idea that once you've got those two skills, the cutbacks and floaters, in the bag, then you have the problem of deciding what maneuver you should do at any point on the wave. And so we just have the simple idea that rather than surfing down the line, you surf to the targets. And the targets are basically wherever the whitewater is breaking, wherever the lip of the wave is, wherever the critical part of the wave is. And when you think about a perfect, Indo reef break, of course, the target would just be one target that's peeling behind you, the critical part of the wave. Actually, when you're surfing beach breaks, usually there's multiple targets because we have different sections breaking. And then every maneuver you do, we're talking about, when you're not Mick Fanning or Kelly Slater, you're sort of average everyday surfer going down the line trying to work on cutbacks and floaters and the occasional hitting of the lip. Every maneuver you do should end with that target, the breaking part of the wave, hitting the board underneath where your front foot is, because that's where you get that push of speed from. When you finish when you finish a cutback and you finish it up at the top of the wave and you feel the lip hit underneath your board just at the end of the cutback, and it gives you that boost and you kind of go back off down the line with a ton of speed, versus when you miss the target and you end up getting a little stuck in the whitewater and kind of having to hop around the foam and get back onto the face again. So that's one example of it. Another example of a target, and this is the first time that we bring it in, is of course when someone's going down the line and the wave's closing out in front of them, so they have a closeout section coming towards them, and then it doesn't involve such a big change of direction in order to go up and again have that bit of lip hit the board underneath that front foot, and they feel that burst of speed as they then come racing down in front of the whitewater out onto the flats. And, we kind of talk about how when you're doing a big carving turn and you're putting all of your weight at the back of the board, you're using up speed because you're digging the tail of the board in and lifting the nose up. And the idea is that when you're doing those turns, you're finishing each of those carving turns by hitting a target where you're regaining all of the speed that you just used up doing your turn. And of course, once you start surfing to targets and linking each target together, that's what we think of as flow. Does that make sense? I'm describing it to you here, but I'm using my hands quite a lot while I'm talking, which is totally useless to all of our listeners.
Yeah, no. I mean, you got so many videos online, which I'll point people towards if they're interested to get that visual. But yeah, no, that's a great way to break it down. I like that analogy. What about, you've also got, I'm sure a lot of this tree of knowledge is far more relevant for those for the guests staying, and maybe a little confusing for those that have never been to your resort. But what's a head snap?
So when we're going through this, when our guests first arrive, we take them in and we kind of say to them, look, we've got this tree of knowledge, and we have it up on the wall, and it's about 12 or 15 feet high, and we say to them, look, go and look at it now. It's going to look completely overwhelming, but as your kind of week and your coaching goes on, you're going to start recognizing bits and going, oh, we did that now, and then we're going to do that next, and then we're going to do that next, and this sort of path opens up in front of you. You can see where things are kind of leading to next. So it kind of makes sense a lot more as part of the coaching program. When your listeners are looking at it, it's not really meant to be just seen completely independent of anything else, But the head snaps up at the top. That's pretty much when you're coming up and you're doing a turn, and you're really getting a lot of the torque in order to bring the board round by rotating your upper body very quickly, as opposed to by carving off your heel on your back foot. And if you look at that, like a lot of the other things on the tree of knowledge, some of them sit on the side and they don't lead on to anything else. And head snaps are one of those things. And it's kind of interesting because there are some things which you might not think are important, but are absolutely foundational to everything else you do. I mean, level 4 coaching, your bottom turns is a really good example that you'll hear competitive level coaches talk about all the time. And then there's other things which, everyone would like to be able to do because they look kind of cool, but they don't really lead on to anything. They're a little bit of a dead end. And you can see head snaps is kind of sitting on the side as kind of a fun thing to be able to do, to have in your arsenal, but it doesn't lead on to anything. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Cool. What about bottom turns to 12 o'clock?
So again, that's just that idea that you're looking at the wave from the beach, and 12 o'clock is straight up, like vertical. So a lot of people, they get pretty good at bottom turns, but they bring their bottom turn up so that they're coming up sort of at 45 degrees to the wave face. So if you imagine you're looking at the wave and it's a clock face, 12 o'clock would be hitting the lip vertically, and 3 o'clock would be just pointing straight down the line. So, most people, if you're coming up, on a left, they'd be coming up at like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, something like that. And people don't really want to come right up and try and bottom turn to 12 o'clock because they're not good enough to do the top turn that will bring them back down into the wave again. So, what they logically think is, look, when I go up right to 12 o'clock, when I go up super vertical, I never make the wave. So I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to only bottom turn as much as I know that I'm going to be able to come back round again. So getting people to actually go, look, don't worry about making the wave. Don't worry about your top turn. What we want is just a bottom turn where you go all the way through with tons of speed, come back up the wave, and we want a freeze frame on the video camera from the beach of your board at 12 o'clock pointing straight up through the lip of the wave. And once we've got that bottom turn really good, then we can start working on your top turn depending on what the wave's doing and the various ways that you're going to turn the board back and come back round. So that's like a classic level 4 coaching thing that we do with shortboarders all the time, and it actually kind of falls in under a bigger umbrella, which is the biggest challenge for us as coaches, which is getting people to not be precious with their waves, which kind of goes back to that idea of trying to make the wave and surf down the line. And, with any sport, when you learn something new, there's 2 steps to it. There's this first step, which is understanding how you do something and why you're going to do it and what the body mechanics is. And you can even understand intellectually what the timing is. And then there's kind of trying to do it, and you're thinking about it. It's not in any way automated, and your brain really isn't actually fast enough to react quickly enough to really make most of it happen in time. So, most of the times you're trying it initially, whatever it is, whether it's, doing an air or a snap off the top, or whether it's kind of standing up on the board for the first time, and it all just feels like it's happening too quickly and it's all going to go wrong. And of course, if you stick with it, eventually it does become intuitive, and that takes 200 reps, 400 reps, 1,000 reps. It depends what the thing is. So, teaching people what it is that they're supposed to practice, but then teaching them not to be so precious with the waves that they don't want to keep with it. They people always want to like shy away from the stuff that's going to take 200 reps because they're like, I could just surf down the line and that's pretty fun and that's going to look cool. And teaching people the value in actually riding off a wave and kind of going for it. And actually, it's funny that concept is so important and it's so critical to surf coaching. And I actually learned it from when I was at art college, bizarrely enough. Our art master in London he saw us everyone being very precious, and like most artists, I used to beat myself up about how good any given painting was. I was doing fine art painting at college. And so he used to make us tear up everything we did at the end of every day. So we would, spend all day working with whatever material it was. And then, everything would go in the trash at the end of the day. And it's kind of heartbreaking. But it was also the most liberating thing, because you realize that nothing that you're doing is going to last. So you're suddenly really free to kind of experiment with it. And sending people out, and this is true whether you're coaching or whether you're yourself and you're never going to get any coaching and you're just listening to this podcast thinking I'm just going to go out free surfing. Just breaking your surfs up into like, okay, 20 minutes. I'm just going to try doing a 12 o'clock bottom turn, for example, and I don't care about making any waves. I'm not even expecting to make one. I'm going to fall off every time, and then your clock beeps on your wrist, and then you're like, okay, now I'm done. I've practiced that. Now I'm going to surf down the line and just enjoy some long rides. And the value of segmenting parts of your surf off where you're not precious with your waves will just pay dividends years down the line.
Yeah, I love that. You're on the money, because, a lot of the anxiety in surfing comes from that, that surfing the wave being such a rare and exclusive experience. We don't want to mess it up, especially when others are looking. But also, to stay on that same kind of theme, surfing to the targets and 12 o'clock bottom turns, head snaps, it's all good and well to understand the technique and the theory behind it, and then you overcome the next hurdle was like, okay, I'm not going to be precious with my waves. But there's another hurdle as well, which is just the fear of putting yourself right in that critical part of the wave. How do you help people overcome that?
That's a really good question, and actually there's kind of two parts to that. I mean, one is just how do you coach people through being intimidated by anything they're dealing with in the water, whether it's the critical part of the wave, doing a maneuver, just being out in big surf. And then the other part is to sort of talk about how you specifically get people over being worried about hitting the targets. So let me just talk about the second one first. Obviously, it's different for everyone, and you need to work with someone and find out what is the limiting factor for them particularly. But the really common one is that people surf with their front foot pointing a little bit forwards, at 45 degrees, which actually isn't functional, and it's not particularly good for your knees either when you're doing it with your back foot in the same sort of pointing back a little bit. But they have their front foot pointing slightly forwards and often slightly off, to the heel side of the board. That's a really common mistake. And then as soon as they go up and they hit a target, a bit of white water, a bit of lip, and it's hitting the bottom of the board underneath where their front foot is, instead of their front foot absorbing that pressure and turning it therefore into forward momentum, the board actually flips. And it can, catch you right between the legs or in the forehead or the nose. I'm sure that you've seen that happen to even really experienced surfers when they go up and hit the lip and their front foot comes off the board and you see the board like crack them in the forehead. So, I mean, usually it's not quite that dramatic. But what does happen is if people's front foot is just off the center, as soon as they have the foam hit the bottom of the board wobbles and, usually they'll come off the board. And actually, this is one of those things where we take them right back to their functional stance. The hands are on either side of the rails, their front foot's square on the front foot, the toe is well on the toe side of the stringer. And then their knee really absorbs that power when it hits the bottom of the board. So, that's just one example of a classic way you can coach someone through that particular problem. But just talking more generally about being intimidated in the ocean, there's like most things, there isn't any one magic answer. You kind of have to approach it from multiple angles. So, being out in big waves particularly, or having the confidence to stuff yourself in the pocket when you want to run for the shoulder, comes from really understanding what's going on and the mechanism of how the wave's working. And, we spend time with people where we'll go out with a mask and swim down under the waves when it's big and really watch what's going on. And we'll get them without a board to sit a little closer to the waves so that, they'll get sucked up and over, or sit a little further down so that they don't. And so they really understand what's going on underneath the water. And we've found that really changes it for a lot of people, because suddenly it's not this mysterious, scary world of blackness, but they really kind of know what's happening. Then there's also, we do breath hold training, which is really important. And again, that helps people a lot. General fitness training, understanding all of the things that can go wrong and how you can deal with all the situations the ocean throws at you. So, one thing we do is we teach people about, leash climbs and safety positions for getting in, and the different ways that you can get through waves on boards that you can duck dive and boards that you can't duck dive. And then we'll kind of sit down with people and we're like, okay, you're on the inside, you've got a wave about to break on your head, you've got a surfer coming down the line, you don't know which way to go, the beach is here or the reef is here, this is the situation, we'll draw it out on the whiteboard. What choices have you got? And then, there'll all be things that we've gone through before, 5 or 6 different options that they've got for tactics for dealing with the situation, and then we'll talk about the pluses and minuses of each tactic. And then what you have is people who are in the ocean who are still going to wipe out, still going to roll around and still get intimidated by waves, but instead of just being in blind panic mode, they're like, okay, we sat in the classroom and we talked through this situation, and I've got 3 options, and if I choose the worst of those options, I know that I'm still going to be okay. And, if I choose the right one, I'm still going to get rattled a bit, possibly, but at least I'm going to minimize it, so it's going to be efficient. And then it becomes just a simple decision-making process. The whole process of being out, not just surfing, but also paddling out and being in the impact zone, just becomes shall I do A, B, or C? And you just keep making decisions all the way, until you're either out the back or you're back on the beach.
Nice. That's a great way to look at it, and I totally agree. Knowledge is power.
Yeah. And knowledge is fun.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's what sparked the conception of this podcast. Is that just little tips like that, and shifts in perspective, and obviously, going and getting lessons and doing courses, and they just stack up on top of each other, and the next thing 2 years later, your surfing has progressed so much more than if you hadn't have invested all that time and knowledge and courses and things. So
yeah, and I think there's for a lot of people there's still a real stigma about being coached in surfing. I think people feel self-conscious about it. I think it's something that people do for fun, and they feel like if they go and get coached, then it sort of says that they're taking it too seriously, and they kind of feel, as I say, they kind of feel self-conscious. We have this chat with people before they go out and do their first video lesson, and if you don't have this conversation with people, you can guarantee that they'll go out and then they'll come back in like a really dark place in their head because they didn't surf as well as they wanted to for the camera, And also when people haven't seen themselves surf before and then they see it on video for the first time, it's mortifying. It's like hearing yourself sing for the first time. It's not good. So we kind of say to people, look, when you go out there, you're not going to surf your best. The chances that you're going to do your best surfing exactly the same session that we pulled the camera out and video you is almost zero. It's just not going to happen. And not only are you not going to surf your best, but you're going to go out there and you're going to make some stupid mistakes. You're going to go over the handlebars, your hand's going to slip off the rail, you'll misjudge the wave and nosedive. And then you'll think in your head, oh, the coach is going to think I always surf like this, and usually I'm much better than this. Oh, this whole thing's a total waste of time, and then you kind of go down that little dark spiral. So, I think it's really important, and if anyone that's listening to this that does video coaching, this is a really important conversation to have with people. Tell them you're only going to be looking at the things that they're doing 4, 5, 6 times. Only the repeated mistakes you're going to be addressing. The one-off mistakes, you're just not even going to address them. You're just going to move on. And just telling people that gives them the freedom to go out and actually surf and have fun. And in front of the camera, which gives you much more useful footage to work with later on. And it's also good to point out to people that really the most useful thing they can do for you as a coach is to make every mistake they ever make surfing that time when you've got the camera out and the camera's pointing at them. I mean, they may feel really stupid, but that's fantastic because it means that you can address everything. And the most unhelpful thing they can do is actually to go out and surf their best, way better than they usually do, because then when you come in, you're going to be addressing all the wrong things.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, I wish someone had told me that ages ago. I've got another question. Just on your website, in the surf coaching section, it's got, and I quote, "You will never hear us offering ambiguous advice like feel the rhythm of the wave. Instead, we communicate, blah, blah, blah." Basically, you're saying, we want to break it down, demystify it, and simplify it so people can learn it. Now, if I backpedal and go back, some of my previous interviews I've done, a lot of the surfers and surf coaches are often talking about the feeling of surfing. Can we analyze that?
So, there's two things there. And actually, it's funny because I was listening to a couple of your podcasts before, and, the people you're interviewing were using that same expression. And I thought, we can talk about that. That's awesome. So first of all, that part of the website, the point that we're making isn't that everything can be completely broken down technically. And, we all enjoy surfing and there's an emotional aspect to it. Which isn't what we do. We just teach people how to surf technically better, and then we hope that kind of joy comes as an emergent property of that. But what we don't do is use ambiguous language. So whenever possible, if we're going to bring in a technical term, and I think this is just true of teaching across the board actually, but whenever you want to communicate something, I think it's really important that if you're going to bring in a term, like earlier I was talking about trimming versus carving, I was very careful to define what I meant by trimming and carving. And, that's really the point. I see a lot of surf coaching going on where people use what I would call, circular logic. So they'll say, I want you to do this better by doing it better. For example, I want you to have more speed through this cutback, so really drive through it. It's kind of like you're telling the guy you want him to go faster when he's coming out of the turn, and so the way you want him to do it is to go faster when he's coming out of the turn. So we want to use really specific language, and we don't want to just try and explain something by just saying the same thing in a different way. That's really the point. The specific example of feeling the rhythm of the wave is interesting because there's a lot of aspects of surfing, and this kind of comes down to critical thinking actually, and evaluating how valid a specific hypothesis is, right? So there's a lot of aspects of surfing that are emergent properties of surfing well, and you hear coaches talk about them as if they are things that you need to do. So let me give you an example. If you're going back to that cutback example, right? If you're going through a cutback and you're coming out of it with a lot of speed, there's a reason why Connor Coffin comes out of his cutbacks with so much speed, right? And telling him just that he needs to, drive through it faster or make sure he turns in rhythm with the wave, actually doesn't really help, because you're just left as the surfer thinking, well, yeah, okay, I know what it looks like when someone's in rhythm with the wave, but how do I get in rhythm with the wave if I'm not in rhythm with it? Just having someone tell me doesn't really help. One of the things that we often see is someone like Tom Curran connecting different maneuvers together really well. It's just as a classic example when I was growing up. And that's because each individual maneuver has been performed at the right time, and the emergent property is, the aggregate of all of those maneuvers, is that there appears to be a fantastic rhythm as he surfs along the wave. But you can't tell someone to do the end result. You have to tell them how to do each maneuver and how to judge each next maneuver. And then the emergent property is you have this sensation of rhythm and this appearance of rhythm as you watch someone else. Another example in competitive surfing is, we talk about, this is a classic conversation you've heard 1,000 times, are you going to win the world title, said to insert title contender's name here. And then, they'll say, hey, I'm just trying to focus on winning heats, and it's just one heat at a time, which is exactly the right response. Winning the world title is an emergent property on a much bigger scale, obviously, to having rhythm in a wave, but it's an emergent property, and actually winning heats is the mechanism by which you get there. So, what we try and do is teach the mechanism rather than just tell people, this is what you want to do. And those are two specific kinds of language, which I think a lot of teachers, and this isn't a surf coaching thing, this is just a teaching thing. I think a lot of teachers and sports coaches fall into that trap, and we certainly do too, but we try to be aware of it and we try to avoid it as much as we possibly can. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, just if we go back to your surfing to the targets, if you went out and spent a session with an intermediate surfer saying, hey, I really want you to surf to these targets, they might come out of that session and they would describe their surfing as being more rhythmic and more flow. They have more flow. So that's how they would describe the feeling of surfing. But you didn't coach that in those terms. You really broke it down into, surf coaching.
Right, exactly. I mean, so again, just to use that world title example, if you were coaching someone to win a world title, you wouldn't say to them, I want you to win a world title. You'd teach them how to surf each wave and get the highest score, and then, like I say, the world title, that or the contest win, or even the heat win, that comes as a result of doing the other stuff. So we try to make sure that we don't put the cart before the horse, which I think a lot of people do. And it's really interesting. I don't know if you ever listened to our podcast, but me and Harry, our coaching director, and some of the other guys, we're all kind of a little nerdy, and we're quite into science, and we're quite into critical thinking. And it's funny how many lessons you can take from that, and you just kind of like plug it into surf coaching, and you get some interesting things come out. One of the common ones we were talking about on the podcast recently, and that we use all the time, is not mistaking correlation for causation. So one of the classic things that you see a lot of videos, like online surf videos, do is that a pro surfer will do a really nice turn, and then the guy doing the voiceover on the video will say, oh, you can see how, whichever the surfer is holding this hand here, he's holding this hand here, he's compressing here, and therefore that's how you do the turn. And it's like, well, possibly, but you don't know which of those things are causing him to do the turn really well, and which of those things were actually, if you took it away, would the turn work just as well? And that's more true for turns off the top than turns off the bottom. But even in bottom turns, I mean, look at how John does a bottom turn, and it's almost like contrary to how bottom turns were taught through most of the late 90s and early noughties. Sort of more up straight and with his hands less out. So it's just kind of interesting making sure that one doesn't assume that just because a surfer is holding their body in a certain way, that is necessarily the thing that's making them surf well. You know what I mean? And again, you have to use that process of, all right, well, if something is very plausible, then, we don't need a lot of evidence to be quite convinced it's probably right. If something's really implausible, then we need a lot more evidence to find out if it's right. And, there's not really anyone out there at the moment who's really, doing a deep dive and trying to do A/B testing and really find out what works and what doesn't work. And it's very tempting to just think, look at how good all the best surfers in the world are. They must be right. I mean, to suggest that they don't know what they're doing is insane. And mostly that's probably true. But there's probably nuanced little things which are going to evolve, because if we look back at the best surfers in the 90s, the way they were surfing was pretty different. I mean, look at the boards everyone was riding in the 90s, right? It's like we all got it wrong. Just everyone got it wrong in the surfing community. And it would be naive to think that right now we are at the pinnacle of knowledge and it won't go forwards. So the conversation we always end up having is, what are the surfers in 2050 and 2070 going to be laughing about when they look at videos of us surfing today? I mean, us collectively as surfers in 2016, and trying to think about what those things might be is a really difficult thought experiment.
Yeah, I do. That's what I love about your podcast, is you really do nerd out and break things down, and educate us a lot. I mean, it's awesome. I think surfing needs more of that, and I also think there's a misconception in the general surfing public that a lot of good surfers are just good surfers because they started when they were 5 and they're natural athletes. But the more I get to know these surfers, just being in the industry, the more I learn how much goes on behind the scenes. Like, so much goes on behind the scenes. It's ridiculous. Like, these surfers that are surfing at these high levels, they are completely 100% obsessed. Like, they are not watching Game of Thrones at night. They are watching surfing videos and slowing them down and breaking them down and doing yoga. They're not doing what most people do to chill out at night. They're studying surfing, and they're really, they're spending money on boards and footage, and there's so much that goes on behind it. So
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Game of Thrones is pretty good, so that's a bit of a sacrifice.
Well, you do have to sacrifice, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's an interesting, I can't remember who wrote it off the top of my head, but there was a really interesting kind of thesis that I was reading on TechCrunch the other day. And he was it was written by some CEO startup from Silicon Valley, and basically he'd written this idea, which is apparently quite well supported by research, that you can put in, if you imagine in order to be the best in the world at something, you have to put in 100% effort, right? Just sort of to give you a scale, right? So if you put in about 20% of that 100%, you can actually get up to being about 80% good at something. And then to climb from 80% to 100%, in other words, that difference between being, the best guy at your local beach break to being on the world tour, that takes the other 80% of effort. It's called the 80-20 principle. If any of your listeners are interested, if you Google it, I'm sure there's a ton of articles they can read. But I mean, it's kind of interesting because, again, we focus mainly on people who are not those elite level competitive surfers, but are just, everyday surfers that you're surfing with every day out at your beach break. And I think sometimes they're almost intimidated by knowing how much work those top guys put in, and they kind of think like, I just surf for fun. I'm not really into doing all of the drills and the coaching and the cross training because I'm not a competitor. And it's like, well, actually, you don't have to, give up watching Game of Thrones. You can just put in 20% of the effort and see a huge increase. And unless you're prepared to put in the other 80%, no, you're not going to make it up to that elite competitive level. But most surfers aren't. I mean, most of us are in it for the reason that I'm in it is because, I just really like being out in the water and surfing, and I love having something that I enjoy that keeps me fit, especially as the years go by. So, I think it's just worth bearing that in mind. And it's kind of hit me recently as well. I'm sort of just coming up to 40 now. The average age of the guests that come and stay with us is 37. We have a lot of people in their 30s and 40s and 50s come along. But most of our guests are really fit, really smart, capable people. And they just have either come to surfing later in life, or they surfed when they were younger, and then family and career took over. And then before they come and stay with us, we send them a whole training program of swimming and whatnot to do in preparation for coming, because it's quite a full-on physical week. And people come along and they're like right in the peak of their fitness, and they're really smart people. It's not a cheap week, so people have to have been good at something to make enough money to come along and stay with us. We had a bunch of people come from Google and Facebook, and I don't know, the word, I guess the gossip's kind of gone around. So now we have a ton of Silicon Valley types come from Google and Facebook, and they're really, really smart, interesting, and interested people. They're really interested in stuff and really capable. And watching the way that those people approach surfing later in life is really inspirational to me, because they're so passionate and they so want to be good at it. And I think we all tend to just again think of this binary thing of there's the beginner doing their their kind of lesson, and then that's it, and we don't take them very seriously. And then there's the really good free surfer who's the best guy at the beach. You'd never see him at a surf school. And actually, these people that are kind of right in the middle there, to me, are just fascinating.
Yeah, oh, totally. And nowadays with the internet, we have all those surfers that are willing to put in that 20% to improve. There's so many resources online, like just your YouTube channel, for instance. I urge people, listeners, to go and check out the Surf Simply website and the YouTube channel and just start learning. And for sure, go and check out what the Surf Simply resort is offering. It looks pretty amazing. It looks pretty awesome. Now, is there any surfer?
Oh, thanks, Mike.
Is there any surfer that would get nothing out of your resort? It looks like even an advanced surfer would enjoy their stay there.
So I guess there's sort of at two ends of the spectrum. We sometimes have people come along who are coming along as like with a friend, or it wasn't really their thing to come along, but they were coming along with a partner or with a friend, and like their physical fitness just becomes the limiting factor pretty quickly. So, if people come along and they're not in great shape, we always say, look, we're going to make sure you have a fantastic time. I mean, we have 12 guests each week, and we have 9 coaches that work with our 12 guests. So, usually it's like 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. It's not like you're going out in a class. So your coach takes it at the same pace. We never mix ability or fitness levels within, little groups. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of a bummer when you see people and you think, look, you've got all the pieces there, but if you're out of puff, after half an hour, that's a very difficult thing to work with as a coach. You just kind of have to slow the pace of things down. You do a little more theory, you take everything a little slower. But, I would really urge people that are thinking about coming along to get in shape before they come. That's one thing. And then, right at the other end of the spectrum, we work a lot with people that are shortboarding and interested in tube riding. We've got a really nice heavy beach break. It's not the one that we surf at every day, but it's about 15 minutes drive north, and it's sand bottomed. So that's a great little place for practicing tube riding. We work a lot with vertical surfing, as we've talked about, on shortboards. When people start getting like up in the air, and doing rodeo clowns, that kind of stuff, and really focusing on specifically competitive surfing, then that then is a little out of our pay grade. I mean, we work with a few people like that, but that's not really what I would say our specialty is. They'd do much better checking out somewhere like where you are at the High Performance Center. And actually, if any listeners are in the US and they've got under 18s that want coaching, one of the guys I used to work with, called Al Esper, runs a program called Initiative Surf. And we used to work together, and he sort of branched off, and he just now works with young competitive kids between like 12 to 18, I think he does. But he runs a great program. So yeah, those are the two kind of bookmarks, I guess, at either end of what we work with.
Yep, okay. And folks that want to learn more, just go to surfsimply.com. Pretty awesome website. You guys have created a great website full of loads of information, but also it almost looks like, just looking at the website, you just know what you're going to get. You guys have got everything covered: meals, accommodation, surfing, education, yoga, blah, blah, blah. I'm actually moving to America soon, and hopefully I'll get a chance to go and come and stay with you guys.
Oh, it'd be great to have you down here sometime. That'd be awesome. And thanks. I really appreciate the kind words about the website. We have like 7 or 8, no, maybe a few more than that, maybe 9 or 10 surf coaching tutorials, just to kind of really to give people an idea of what we do. They're a little bit out of date now, so I probably need to shoot them on an HD camera to keep up with what the internet has to offer these days. But people seem to find them helpful. So if they're helpful to any of your listeners, that's great. And thanks so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm a big fan of what you do. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you. And also, by the way, listeners, there is a Surf Simply podcast as well, available on their website as well as on iTunes. I recommend that. I'm a listener as well. But before you go, Roo, can I just ask you a quick few questions? What's your favorite surfboard?
So my current favourite surfboard, not high performance at all, actually, is as I stole off my fellow podcast host Harry. I stole his 5'8" round nose fish. You know, the lost round nose fish, the same as the one they had in 5'5" by 19 3/4. And I've been surfing that for the last couple of months and just having a ton of fun on it. Some of your listeners might be familiar with Harrison Roach. And we have a little Surf Simony magazine, and he writes for our magazine as well. And he and I were chatting the other day about an article he just put up recently, which is all about how, you know, fishes are often thought of as small wave boards, but they're great in big waves. And I've been trying to put that to the test with mixed degrees of success. I'm not nearly as good a surfer as him.
Okay, I've got a fish. Just on that note, I've got a fish board called the Alien by Formula Energy, which is a board design that Gary McNeil and David Rustovich came up with, and it's such an all-round surfboard. It works from 1 foot to... I've surfed it in like choppy 8-foot waves, and it held its own far better than I expected. So go and check that board out, the Alien model from Formula Energy. Okay, the second quick question is, what's your favourite surfing vid?
Well, we reviewed South to Cyan, and I'm kind of biased because, Harrison made the movie. But I do think it's just a beautiful movie. I really love, the way they're riding slightly bigger boards, and it's just beautifully shot. I've got View from a Blue Moon as my screensaver on my computer at the moment, so it kind of pops up. I love John surfing. I think that's just a beautifully shot movie as well. I think those two at the moment are kind of standing head and shoulders above the rest for me.
Awesome. Favourite surfer?
It has to be John. I'm sorry, that's such a predictable answer, but I mean, it's like, how could you not love watching him surf? It's so good. And he's such a nice guy as well. We were staying next door to him in France a few years ago, and we got to have a little chat, and yeah, just such a humble, unpretentious guy, very positive, and yeah, just huge fan.
Agreed. Do you listen to music before you surf, and if so, what's your current favourite song or album?
Yeah, I do. I've got my Spotify. I got into Spotify recently, so I'm trying to. Actually, it's funny talking about being not precious with stuff. So when I got Spotify about 6 months ago, I deleted all of the music I'd ever owned and just decided to start again from zero in that spirit of trying to not be precious with stuff. So I'm discovering like a lot of new stuff at the moment, which is pretty fun. But I've got a secret soft spot for Aphex Twin, which is this kind of off-the-wall English electro stuff that most people probably hate that I play it to, so maybe that's not one I should recommend to your listeners.
Okay, cool. Roo, thank you so much for your thoughts on surfing, and I'm looking forward to more podcast episodes, more video tutorials, and hopefully eventually coming to stay with you guys, and maybe even future podcast episodes. Looking forward to it. Again, thanks, Roo.
Thank you so much, Mike. Again, I'm a huge fan of the show, and I just think it's a great project that you've got going with the Surf Mastery. So, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to the Surf Mastery podcast. Again, I'm your host, Michael Frampton. Make sure you subscribe so you can keep up to date with the latest interviews. Please share with your friends. Check us out on Facebook at Surf Mastery Surf. And if you're on iTunes, please go and give us a little rating. That'd be awesome. Until next time, keep surfing.